News of the Times, the Matricide in Chisenhale Street. Welcome to News of the Times. In today's episode, it is 1873 in Liverpool, and a crime of an absolutely horrific nature takes place with the murder of a mother by her son. There are no potential mitigating factors of insanity or drink in this case, just pure evil. The case, which was considered utterly shocking by the sheer depravity of the scene, her face was spoken of as resembling pulp, horrified the community. The judge in the case is clearly appalled. It is interesting to note the utter change of character or change of heart demonstrated by the alleged murderer whilst in prison. Be forewarned, there is some graphic content from the papers in this story. And in continuing the mothers of all types theme, today's end of episode for the particular story looks at the case of a man who has insured his mother-in-law but is dismayed that after 9 years she continues to survive. Can he get his money back? The case was considered highly amusing in 1894. If this all sounds like a far better thing than immersing yourself in a rather innumerable chores around the house, we would be grateful if you could give us a like with the thumbs up button. If you haven't subscribed, it would be fab if you could. It confounds the YouTube algorithm, which is always a good thing. Many thanks. And now, on with the show. Background. Thomas Corrigan, 23, has a reputation in the village. Well known with the local constabulary, he has been placed in a cell several times in the past due to his aptitude for finding a fight. Corrigan begins a relationship with Martha Ann Knight, with whom he has 2 children. The two live together as man and wife, although no lawful ceremony has taken place. Martha Ann Knight, Corrigan's live-in partner, is described as a quite attractive woman and belonging to a more respectable class originally than that of Corrigan. After some time, Corrigan introduces his partner to his parents, and it would appear moves his paramour and 2 children into the house where his parents reside. This does not go down well. There are mixed stories regarding the relationship said to exist between Corrigan and his mother. Some neighbours state that they had seen Corrigan manhandle his mother in past incidents. Other neighbours state that the two had a friendly relationship. Whatever the relationship may have been, it becomes clear that Corrigan's mother has taken a dislike to his girlfriend, Miss Knight, and from here things go very badly indeed. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 3rd of November 1873, brutal murder in Liverpool, a mother killed by her son. A murder the most horrible in its character which perhaps has ever occurred in Liverpool was committed on Saturday evening in Chisenhale Street off Vauxhall Road. The crime is all the more dreadful from the fact that it was perpetrated by a son upon a mother in cold blood without the slightest provocation. Number 30 in Chisenhale Street, the house in which the murder took place, was occupied by a day labourer named Patrick Corrigan and his wife Mary, the deceased woman. It was registered as a lodging house, the lodgers at the present time being a labourer named James Harris and his wife and 3 children, who occupied an apartment on the 1st floor, and a man named James Canavan. Corrigan and his wife are stated to have been a respectable couple, and the house for such a neighbourhood certainly bears evidence from its clean appearance of the woman having been a good housewife. Their son, Thomas Corrigan, is a powerfully built young fellow of 23 years of age, who, when he cared to work, was employed as a dock porter. With the police, however, he has an extremely bad reputation and is said to be one of the very worst characters in the town. He had been frequently charged with assaults upon the police and other persons, and has several times suffered imprisonment for this class of offence. In fact, he was regarded with terror by all who knew him. He had for the past 2 years cohabited with a woman named Martha Knight, who had borne him 2 children, but it was not until recently that he had persisted in taking his paramour to his father's house. The introduction of this woman to the family household seems to have been the cause of grief to his mother, and it is supposed that she had remonstrated with him upon the subject. On Saturday evening, Corrigan went to bed with the woman Knight at an early hour, but about 6:30 came downstairs dressed, with the exception of his boots, and asked his mother, who was sitting by the fireside in the kitchen, for his supper. She seems to have been in fear of him, and thereby replied evasively that it was in the oven. Apparently, he was either not satisfied with this reply or determined to ascertain the fact for himself, and he opened the oven door. Finding that his mother had deceived him, he used some strong language to her, and she endeavoured to appease him by saying that a younger sister had gone for it. Harris and his wife and the man Canavan were in the room at the time. Notwithstanding their presence, he, first calling his mother a foul name, seized her by the hair of the head and knocked her down several times. He then kicked her about the head, body, and legs, and placed his hands upon a round table in the centre of the room, jumped up on her with all the force he could command. The poor creature was at length rendered senseless by the brutal treatment of her son, and an attempt by Harris to prevent further ill treatment was met by an attack upon him by the ruffian. Harris is an undersized man, and being unable to cope with the scoundrel, was speedily silenced. Mrs. Harris, assisted by the woman Knight, undressed Mrs. Corrigan and placed her in a bed in a room adjoining the kitchen, and imagined that the outrage was concluded. But the son's brutal passion was not satiated, and procuring water, he poured it upon his mother to bring her round. The water revived the poor woman, and taking advantage of his momentary absence from the bedroom, she crept upstairs into the apartment occupied by the Harrises. Returning to the room and finding it tenantless, he went upstairs, and discovering his mother crouched behind the door, he again assailed her, and taking her by the hair, threw her with great violence down the stairs. He followed, and he recommenced his brutal treatment, although by this time she was in a perfectly nude state. Taking a leather belt off his waist, he wound a portion around his hand and inflicted blow after blow upon the poor creature's head with the buckle. Then, having knocked her down, he kicked her and repeated the process of jumping upon her with his hands up on the table. She was by this time again insensible, but taking up a knife, he said to her, "You bitch, I may as well be hung for you as anyone else." There is no doubt he intended to inflict some wound upon her, but the woman Harris entreated him to desist, and he then laid the knife upon his mother's neck. It was by this time nearly, if not quite, 9 o'clock, and during the period between this hour at 6:30, the attack upon the woman was almost without intermission. The persons in the room were paralyzed with fear and were convinced that they had attempted to interfere, they would have met with a similar fate. It is said, too, that the miscreant had locked the door and had several times threatened the spectators of the dreadful tragedy. The father, it is stated by one person, was a witness of a portion of his son's brutality, but in some way managed to escape from the room. There is reason, however, to doubt this, for it is impossible to conceive that he would not have sought the assistance of the police and the neighbours, and it is certain he did neither. The fact otherwise inexplicable that the attention of the neighbours was not attracted to the outrage by the screams of the woman in probability due to the fact that disturbance is in the locality are so frequent an occurrence that it's called for neither interference nor alarm. After Corrigan had concluded his atrocity, his mother was placed in bed and the Reverend Father Ross of Eldon Place was sent for by one of the inhabitants of the house. The reverend gentleman arrived in a short time, was told by the murderer that his mother had fallen down the stairs. Suspecting foul play, Father Ross proceeded to the Chisenhale Street Bridewell nearby and communicated his suspicion to the Bridewell keeper, who apprised Police Constable 315 McDowell of the information which had been given him. McDowell, who had previously convicted Corrigan for an assault upon which Corrigan had suffered 2 months' imprisonment, had only proceeded a short distance from the Bridewell when he met his former assailant and accosted him with the remark, "Here, Tommy, I want you." Corrigan replied, "All right, I know all about it. I want you to call a doctor. My mother has died suddenly." He was at once made prisoner and taken to the Bridewell, and afterwards, when it was found that his mother was dead, he replied in answer to the charge of murder, "No, sir, you are wrong. Who can prove that? I only came to the officer to get a doctor." Prior to this, a telegram had been sent to the Central Police Office in Dale Street for Inspector Macaulay, who, on arriving, proceeded to Corrigan's house and there found a frightful sight. The murdered woman was lying on the bed in the room near the kitchen, her face a mass of pulp and blood issuing from her eyes, ears, and mouth. On the floor was the quantity of the poor creature's hair covered with blood, a sheet also saturated with gore, and an apron which the prisoner had compelled the woman Harris to wash. The inspector, without delay, sent for Dr. Donovan of the Vauxhall Dispensary, who, on examining the body, pronounced life to be extinct. There were confused wounds, each about an inch long and reaching the bone on the top and the back of the head. The ball of the left eye was ruptured, the whole of the ribs on the left side fractured, and there was contusions innumerable on all parts of the body and limbs. A police constable remained in charge of the body, and the prisoner, who was perfectly sober, went into custody. It seemed entirely unimpressed by the horrible nature of his crime, and he was removed to the main Bridewell. It will be brought before the magistrate and probably remanded until a post-mortem examination has been made of the body. His paramour, Knight, had disappeared and had not been discovered up to a late hour last night. The street was visited by thousands of persons yesterday. Word spreads rapidly in the area of the horrific nature of the crime, with crowds of horror tourists descending upon the house where the gruesome murder took place. Corrigan is brought before the magistrate to assess if there is a potential case against him, whether bail will be appropriate. Corrigan himself refutes any guilt in the matter, stating that he was in drink at the time and remembers nothing. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 4th of November 1873, the Matricide in Chisenhale Street. Yesterday, Thomas Corrigan, 23 years of age, was brought before Mr. Raffles at the Borough Police Court, charged with causing the death of his mother, Mary Corrigan. Mr. Davies, who prosecuted, was proceeding to state the facts of the case when Mr. Raffles said he thought there was an occasion to do so, as the facts had been published in the papers and were now, no doubt, everyone known. Mr. Davies said there were one or two exceptions to those accounts to be noticed. The prisoner had been drinking during the early part of Saturday, but had slept off the effects. The deceased was not drunk, but was in drink at the time of the occurrence. Joanna Harris said she was the wife of Richard Harris, who lived at 30 Chisenhale Street, where the prisoner's father and mother also lived. She lived in the first room on the first floor, and the prisoner, with a woman named Martha, lived in the garret of the house. On Saturday night, about 7 o'clock, the witness said her husband were in their room and the deceased was also with them. The deceased was sitting on a form and crying about the conduct of her son, and the woman, the prisoner, came downstairs and, calling his mother by a foul name, asked for his supper. She said it was in the oven. He went to the oven and, not finding it there, asked again where it was, repeating the foul expression. The prisoner said the prisoner's sister, Kate, had gone for it. The prisoner then took hold of his mother by the shoulder and thumped her with his fist. He then caught her by the hair of the head and knocked her onto the floor. When she recovered herself, he again got hold of her by the hair of the head and knocked her on the broad of her back, her head coming against the floor. Then he turned to his father, who was sitting next to the door, and made a grab at him, but his father ran out and did not return until his wife was dead. In answer to a remark from Mr. Raffles, Mr. Davies said he thought Mr. Raffles would find that the father was comparatively a small man and had painful experiences of his son's brutality previously. Mr. Raffles said there was no excuse. People had tongues in their mouths to speak with. It made one's blood boil to imagine such things could happen in a house among a number of people. The witness continued to say that the prisoner, having accidentally struck her husband, said, I beg your pardon. The prisoner then took hold of a man named Caravan by the hair of the head and dashed him on the floor beside the prisoner's mother. Caravan then got to his feet and was again dashed to the floor by the prisoner, and on again recovering his feet, he ran away. The prisoner again lifted up his mother by the hair of the head and dashed her on the ground. Witness was standing on the floor, begging the prisoner to give over. Mr. Raffles, the magistrate asked, could not you call for help? The witness said she could not, because the prisoner's father had run out, and his aunt, who had been in, had also run out. The prisoner then placed his hands on the table and leapt on his mother's body and actually danced upon her for witness did not know how long. He said he would kill the drunken bitch. After he had danced on her stomach, she was seemingly lifeless. The prisoner had previously smashed in the panels of the door and now dashed the door against the banisters and called out for his girl, Miss Knight, making use of a vile name. He called her several times as she was frightened to come down. The injured woman was washed and put to bed, and having come round after a drenching of water, she got out and crept downstairs while the prisoner was in the kitchen speaking to his girl. The prisoner found his mother on the landing and said, "You drunken bitch, go down." He got hold of her and threw her down the stairs, and she fell with her head first. When she came down, the poor creature started to her feet. Here, both Mr. Davis and Magistrate Raffles interrupted the evidence. Mr. Davis asked whether the injured woman dies. The witness said she did. Mr. Raffles said there was sufficient evidence for a remand. Mr. Davis said there was a great number of details, including the beating of the deceased woman with the buckle and other things. The prisoner began to ask questions of the witness, but on Mr. Raffles asking him if he had anything to ask in reference to the charge, he said, "I am not guilty." He was remanded until Friday. The prisoner, who had been brought up 5 times previously at the Borough Police Court, is a powerful young fellow with sandy hair and has a forbidding countenance. The inquest continued on the following day with more details of the horrific murder of the mother of Thomas Corrigan. The jury brought in a verdict of wilful murder. Thomas Corrigan would go to trial. And the trial begins on the 16th of December 1873 at the Liverpool Assizes. Thomas Corrigan continues his plea of not guilty based on his having been drinking with his mother and therefore not remembering any of the details of the events. Harrowing testimony is brought forward from the medical examiner. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 17th of December 1873, the Chisenhale Street murder. Dr. Donovan said, "On the night of the 1st of November, I was called to the house in Chisenhale Street. I saw the body of the deceased woman there. It was quite warm. On making an examination, I found a contused wound on the top of the head, exposing the skull. There was a second wound at the back of the head, also exposing the skull. The face was very much swollen and was covered with contusions. The features were scarcely recognizable. The left eyeball was ruptured, the contents of the eye protruding. She was bleeding from the left ear, the nose, and in the mouth. 3 of the lower ribs were fractured on the left side, and there was a square-shaped contused wound cutting through the skin on the front of the right shoulder. There was also a wound on the back. The square wounds corresponded with the buckle of the belt. After making an examination of the body of the deceased woman, I went to Chisenhale Street, Bridewell, with Inspector Macaulay. I saw the prisoner sitting in the Bridewell. He was as quiet as he is now. I did not see any signs of intemperance about him. If he had been suffering from delirium tremens, he could not have got quiet so soon without sleep or medicine. On the 3rd of November, I made a post-mortem examination of the body of the deceased. My opinion is that the immediate cause of death was the fracture of the skull, which caused extravasation of blood on the brain. There was a rupture of the spleen, which was sufficient to cause death. The wound at the back of the head had either been caused by a fall down the stairs or by hitting the head against the door. With the repeat of the previous evidence as well as the medical testimony, the prosecution rests. The defence, in the face of overwhelming evidence, does its best. It is not enough. Mr. Thurlow, in addressing the jury on behalf of the prisoner, said that all of the lots which befell members of the bar, he was sure there was none more responsible than the one of the defending, a human creature who being tried for his life. But if his responsibility was great, That of the jury was even greater, as they had to decide whether the prisoner's life had to be taken away or not, and he was sure that in considering the case they would dismiss from their minds anything which they had heard or previously read to coming into court, because he could not hide from himself the fact that a case of such extraordinary brutality could not fail to have come to their ears long before they were elected to serve as jurymen. And now let them consider what murder was. Murder was wilfully and of malice and aforethought killing a fellow creature, and it must of necessity be in effect in the case that the person who took away his fellow creature's life was in such a state of mind at the time that he knew what he was about. The case of a man killing his mother rarely occurs in this country, and he should ask the jury seriously to consider whether that very fact of itself, seeing that in this case there was no provocation, no blow, no angry words, and no real dispute of any description, which could have driven this man into such a perfect frenzy as to raise his hand against this unfortunate mother. Did this not show that he did not know what he was doing? In cases of murder, they were accustomed to look for the motive, but where was the motive here? Was there not a thorough absence of motive? On the contrary, the evidence went to prove that the mother and the son were both very fond of each other, and he therefore said that the case was one of the most extraordinary character. It appears that the prisoners were both very drunk at the time, and although drunkenness is no excuse of any crime whatsoever, yet it is often of very great importance in cases where it is a question of intention. He, the learned counsel, wishes to put before the jury that the prisoner at the time he committed this act was labouring under more than an ordinary degree of drunkenness. He was labouring, as the witness Knight said, under some sudden fit of the horrors. Taking away the intention, the crime was only one of manslaughter. The jury retired to consider their verdict, and after an absence of 10 minutes returned into the court. On being asked the usual question by the clerk as to whether the prisoner was guilty of murder, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The prisoner, when asked if he had anything to say, replied in a low tone, "I have nothing to say." His lordship, having assumed the black cap, said, "Thomas Corrigan, you have been found guilty of the highest crime known to the law, the crime of murder, and, shocking to relate, the murder of your own mother, whom it was your duty to protect, cherish, and defend. Your crime, therefore, is of the highest character, and all this has been brought on, and I wish everyone to hear me when I say so, by drink and habitual drunkenness." Given the horrific nature of the crime and the rarity of matricide cases in court, the case is followed eagerly by the national papers. One article at the time of the trial reports into the particular characters of both Corrigan and his paramour, Miss Knight, who stridently attempted to support him in court. Incidents of the trial. Great interest was evinced in the trial of the prisoner, apparently owing to the shocking brutality which he had shown in the committal of the crime. The court set at 9:30, and before that time a great number of persons had obtained admission, whilst a large crowd was waiting outside with a view of getting into the court. As time advanced, the place was crowded, a good proportion being females, and most of them most respectable classes of society. The grand jury box was occupied mostly by well-dressed females, some mere girls, only whilst the box to the right of the judge was filled by a dozen ladies. The prisoner, being called, ascended the steps into the dark with a light and active step, and advanced to the rail in front of the dock in the same way. He stood with one hand resting upon the other in much the same way as a soldier standing at ease, but his bearing was erect. He seldom moved, and he looked steadfastly to the front. He remained much in this position nearly the whole of the trial, and bore himself with the greatest calmness. There were only two occasions where he appeared to be at all moved. When Mrs. Harris, the principal witness, was giving her evidence, which she did so with such remarkable clearness that the judge complimented her upon it, and when she was repeating the expression used by the deceased woman, "Oh, you are a good son, Thomas, don't," a crimson flush passed over the face of the prisoner, and he took a handkerchief from his breast and wiped away the tears which were evidently flowing. He, however, immediately regained his composure and assumed his steadfast and immovable expression of countenance. The other occasion upon which he appeared to be at all affected was when the judge assumed the black cap, when it seemed as though a few tears were drawn forth. On hearing the sentence pronounced, the prisoner was as if fixed to the point, and a gentle tap from an official in the dark had to be given to call his attention and to remind him that his trial was over. With a faltering step, he moved from the dock, but slightly recovered himself, looked around the court, and then slowly descended the steps. The young woman, Martha Ann Knight, with whom the prisoner had cohabited, is rather good-looking and was respectably retired. She was in what may be called half mourning, and appears to belong to a more respectable class than that of the prisoner. She gave her evidence in so low a tone of voice that she could hardly be heard, even by the judge. You frequently had to tell her to speak louder. She showed no emotion in the witness box, but there was an evident desire on her part to say all she could in the prisoner's favour, and she fell in readily with the suggestions contained in the questions of the counsel for the defence as to whether the prisoner was not wild, and that she had never known him in such a state before. She remained within the precincts of the court until after the trial, and on learning that Corrigan had been sentenced to death, cried bitterly. Some of the ladies who had been in court commiserated with her, and shortly after she was conducted away by a kindly police officer. In Kirkdale jail, Corrigan, who had until his trial been noted for his somewhat defiant manner, is now quite subdued. He is seen and heard frequently to bemoan his own action and express words of tenderness about his battered mother. He appeals to Reverend Ross, the district priest, to visit him and to start up a petition requesting mitigation of his sentence of death. There is little willingness on the part of the public to push this forward. The execution will take place. From the Liverpool Mercury, the 6th of January 1874. Prisoner was perfectly resigned to his fate, and when the prison bell commenced to toll, and it was announced to him that his moments upon earth were few, he did not betray the least emotion. It had been expected that Calcraft would perform the last office of the law, but he could not attend, and in his place the sad duty was carried out by his assistant, a man whose name is stated to be Anderson, but whose real name is supposed to be Evans, who, it is said, is a Welsh farmer. The criminal walked with a firm step, but looked extremely pale. He responded in a low tone of voice to the prayers of the priest who recited the litany for a happy death. When he got on the scaffold, he walked directly under the beam and placed his hands in the attitude of prayer, repeating after the priest. The executioner went about his work quickly. He strapped the convict's legs, placed the noose around his neck, put the white cap over his face, drew the fatal bolt, and Corrigan remained suspended. There was a slight struggle or two after he fell, but he seemed to die an easy death. After the execution, the black flag was hoisted to indicate to those outside that the last sentence of the law had been carried out. Further particulars. What to do when you've put money into what should be a money-making investment only to find out that not only have you not been getting the expected payout, but that the rules have changed. Such is this story from 1894, where a gentleman is convinced to purchase a life assurance policy against his mother-in-law. But several years into the investment, where the mother-in-law irritatingly continues to thrive, he is now told that he can only recover his investment if the said mother-in-law signs a paper allowing collection of the invested money upon her death. Alas, the said mother-in-law says no, and the insurer now wants his money back. From the Illustrated Police News, 17th of March 1894, insuring a mother-in-law, curious, friendly society case. The action was of somewhat unusual kind. The plaintiff was a grocer living at Burnley, and he had insured the life of his mother-in-law, laughter, with the defendants, the insurance company, the Liverpool Victoria Legal Friendly Society. The legal question arose whether or not the plaintiff would have an insurable interest in the life of his mother-in-law, laughter. The policy was effected in 1885, and the defendant continued to pay the premiums up to December, laughed. The lady had lived instead of dying, laughter, and the plaintiff had ceased to pay the premiums and brought his action to recover back the £22 odd, the amount he had paid. In order to make a cause of action, the plaintiff alleged that a representation was made to him in May 1885 by an agent of the defendant, stating that if he insured his mother-in-law's life, he would be paid the money on her death. He did not allege that the representative was made fraudulently or with the knowledge that it was untrue. In August last, the plaintiff was informed by the defendants, the above-mentioned insurance company, that the sum accumulated would not be paid to him on the death of his mother-in-law unless she signed a nomination paper under the Friendlies Society Act. The mother-in-law declines to do this, and the plaintiff now said he had suffered damage by being induced to enter into the insurance. Their lordships refused the motion. That concludes this episode of the Matricide in Chisenhale Street. We very much hope you enjoyed the show. If this has been your cup of tea and you can picture yourself whiling away several hours productively drenching yourself in the dark side of Victorian England, please can you give us a thumbs up? And if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. It costs nothing and inspires us to continue to immerse ourselves in long lost crimes and cryptic clues. Thank you. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles.